Okay, then we're ready to roll. And basically, we've been talking about discovering creation, and science cries out creation. We start with the biblical framework as well of Genesis 1 through 2 of the creation and a great design. Then something happened to that great design. That's Genesis 3 to 5. That's fallen in the death. Tonight, we are hitting on Genesis 6 through 8, flood and destruction. Can you really believe the Bible? Okay. In other words, these are some of the most challenged chapters of the Bible, Genesis 6 through 8, relating to the flood. And so we're going to answer that. Noah's flood, fiction or reality? So the point of this here is if you can explain the geologic record with a flood, guess what? You don't need those millions of years at all. And so that's something to keep in mind, okay? And now I want to give you the disclaimer that a lot of the material that we will be presenting this evening, and you may have seen a lot of that from earlier presentations and or if you've been with us for a number of years. But what we are hoping to do is get the general presentation, the science cries out creation, and eventually get it into the hands of as many young people as possible across the nation and worldwide. And we'll start small, hoping to build. These series of presentations will be repeated August 8th through 11th. Okay, and then we'll go from there and keep doing that. And we're also hoping that the replays will have a broad distribution. So that's what we're hoping to do with all of this. Okay, so if you're familiar, hang on for a great review. Okay, uh, so speaking at a Colorado School of Mines, a student said, "How did Noah get all those stinking animals on board that tiny boat?" And I said to him, "How big is the boat?" He said, "I don't know. I never looked into it." I said, "Well, how many animals at least had to go on board that boat?" He said, "Well, I haven't looked into that either, but certainly they could not have fit." And so I basically said at this university, what you are trying to say is that that an unknown number of animals can't fit on board a boat of unknown size. Okay. And so the students he was trying to rally to get to laugh at me because I believed in the flood began to kind of laugh at him. So I hated to do that, poor guy, but he was suffering from this misconception of what the ark really looked like. A little tiny boat. And of course, there's no way you're going to get all of those species of animals, but keep in mind, God said families anyhow. But even then, that boat was very big, given in the biblical record in cubits, 300 cubits long. That means that little tiny boat wasn't tiny. In fact, it would have been approximately 2.5 football fields in length. And so that's, as you can see from that picture, that's a big ark, isn't it? And so basically, there's no problem getting all the animals that needed to go on board that particular boat into the fit on that ark at all. You know, the flood is one of the most documented biblical events, and virtually all of the writers made mention of it one way or the other, and some a whole lot more. Even Jesus believed in the flood. So if he believed in the flood, I guess I better too. And so it's very documented. Um, Now, there is also archaeological evidence around the world for the very same flood. And so that's very important to understand that. And yeah, like for instance, Sumerian king list names king who reigned for long periods of time. Then a great flood came. And then after that flood, Sumerian kings ruled for much shorter periods of time. Well, the Sumerians had two different types of numbering systems, we can tell. Um, and one of them, if you use that particular numbering system, it turns out the ages of those patriarchs were a virtue of their patriarchs, their kings were virtually the age of our biblical patriarchs. And so that really does help to substantiate it. But that's what the Bible says too. Our patriarchs of the biblical patriarchs lived to be around 900 years. Everybody knows Methuselah was the oldest man in the Bible at 969. A lot of people don't realize that Noah himself was 950 years old. And people say, see, that's a myth. You know, people can't live that long. So how could that be a possibility? Um, as a scientist and somebody who also believes in the scripture, I would say, I would have to say, if when I encounter something like that, what would the conditions have been like in order for that to happen? So not just dismiss it because it doesn't fit with what we see today, but what would those conditions be like? And so there are ways of explaining that scientifically. Some suggested the canopy model, some suggested higher uh, magnetic field or greater magnetic field, all kinds of different things. But we'll get into just a little bit of that. But you notice at the time of the flood that all of a sudden the age of the patriarchs started going down, 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 down until today. If you live to be 100, you're doing pretty good. And and so you see the pattern here. But you might say, hold on, hold on. What about that guy? He doesn't fit the pattern at all. You know, that particular one there, it's way down there at 350 roughly. Well, that's Enoch. He didn't die. Okay. God took him directly. And so, so no, it doesn't matter that it doesn't fit the pattern here. We have Babylonian documents also talking about the very same flood. One of those is the Gilgamesh epic, the 11th chapter. And you could actually see the fragments. You can actually decipher them. I'm not me, but some can. There was an ark, animals taken on board the ark, birds sent out during the flood, and the ark landed on a mountain. Does that sound like anything, Deborah, you ever read in the Bible?
Have I?
Yeah.
No, that's not familiar at all.
Yeah.
Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah, it is. Now, some people say, oh, it's so close to the biblical record that maybe the Bible was borrowed from the Gilgamesh epic. And why is everything borrowed? Why is the Bible always the one borrowing from all of this instead of them borrowing from the biblical record?
Because if they believed it was true, they'd have to answer to God.
I think that's true. And so we see with the biblical, the Gilgamesh epic was written, I believe, about 650 AD or BC. And when we see books of Moses, wait a minute, hold on. It looks like Gilgamesh might be older than the writings of Moses, huh? Some people have said that, except for one thing, the biblical flood probably occurred over, you might say, 1700 years earlier than the Gilgamesh epic. And when you read the biblical record, you find out that it looks like this was actually eyewitness reports of what's going on. And so then Moses puts it together. That's one of the theories, all now called the books of Moses. But it looks like the record that the Gilgamesh may have used would have been Noah's family's own record. That is a very good potential. And so basically, we're looking at that. The Gilgamesh does have a problem that their arc is shaped kind of like a cube. And I'd hate to roll around in rough seas in that cube. That would be really tough. But the biblical dimensions for the ark are really just perfect for righting itself in rough seas. And it's really good for stability. And modern shipbuilders have used those dimensions for a long time because of the stability. And so I'm going to say the biblical record is probably first starting from Noah, then the Gilgamesh epic. All right. There are over 270 flood legends from around the world in different parts of the world, all over. In fact, you have the Hawaii and the Toltec, you have et cetera, all kinds of them. They all have boats, and their boats usually reflect the boats they have in their culture. And and so when we look at that, we say that sounds like they know of an event, and it's passed down through their ancestors relating to the flood. Some of these places never even had missionary activity, and so we say they're all pointing to the reality of something. Even the characters of the Chinese language,
Right.
basically their words are made up of stuff that you might say have biblical origin. Like the word for boat is made up of 8 mouths in a vessel. How did you get that for boat? Noah, his wife, 3 sons, 3 daughter-in-laws. That's 8 people. There is several books out now talking about how the Chinese language actually reflect Genesis in so many of the details and doctrines presented in Genesis. We have one of them called the Discovery of Genesis in the Chinese language. But there's another book that just came out, and it's called Echoes of Ararat. And
Yeah.
one of the big themes in this particular one, it just came out. In fact, I just got the exam copy of a couple of, a week ago. But anyhow, Echoes of Ararat talks about collection over 300 flood legends from just North and South America. All right. And it also talks about Ararat type of uh, uh, descriptions. It talks in there as well of the Tower of Babel, the whole gambit of biblical history there. Echoes of Ararat. And the foreword was written by Ken Ham. And so if you're interested in that, let us know. We can get that for you. All right. Um, but one of the things that sets Noah's account over and above every other one of them is the detail. A lot of legends. How do they start? Myth. How does a myth start? Once upon a time in a distant land, right? And no, that's not how the Noah's account starts. So I call this Noah's ship log. Note the specific dates. When did the flood start? Year 1, month 2, day 17 is the start of the flood. So he is actually recording this as it starts, okay? And so it says in Genesis 7:11, in the 600th year of Noah's life, that's pretty specific, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on the same day, we find 2 sources for water. All the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of the sky were opened. So you have 2 different ways of getting the water, don't you? So this is detail. And then that detail continues when the ark grounds on a mountain, the tops of the mountains visible, specific part of the year, the month, and the day. And even when Noah was told to leave the ark in the second year, second month, the 27th day. And so you can find out that Noah was on the ark a little bit more than a year, wasn't he? And so that is specific detail that none of the other accounts really have at all. It was not just a little rain, windows of heaven opening up. I don't really know what that looks like, but I hope I have a good umbrella. All right. But the fountains of the great deep are opening up as well. And that seems like the water geysers. Some suggest that's also volcanic activity that's going on at that particular point. Well, what we do find is Noah's flood is a worldwide flood. It's not some local flood. Many Bible colleges teach Noah's flood was just local, just killed the people in the Mesopotamia region, and then it was over. And a gentleman by the name of Dr. Ross says it was universal in extent, but not worldwide. All right. Well, that's not the biblical description. Let me show you why I think, even from the Bible, that it was not a local flood at all. Why have such a big ark? The need for it, 450 to 600 feet long. You don't need that for a local flood. And also the inclusive language of destruction. All flesh perished from under heaven. From under heaven is pretty inclusive, isn't it? Except for what's under in the ark or that can swim in the ocean. And according to the scripture, there are birds on board the ark. Why take birds on board the ark for a local flood? They can just fly away and they'd be just fine. All right, not a problem whatsoever. And the water covers the tops of the tallest mountains. Now, here's where the skeptics say, oh, that's really proves it's a myth because we don't have enough water to cover the tops of the tallest mountains right now. Well, you look at the tallest mountains, like at Banff. You're familiar with that one, Bill, I'm sure. All right. But you look at those mountains, what are these mountains made out of? Those are all sedimentary layers right there. That means they're put down by water. These are particles that are water deposited. Tops of the tallest mountains. This includes Mount Everest. And in fact, you look at Mount Everest, the last 1,000 feet at least of Everest is sedimentary. And those layers contain fossils of creatures which once lived in an ocean. Now, some people say, aha, this proves the flood for sure. No, not quite. All it proves is those mountains were underwater at one time. And standard geologists say, well, these mountains were underwater, and then forces in the earth push them up. Tectonic plate movement, tectonic building is mountain building, and all of this rose up. And we do note that happens. Even the area around Everest is still rising. Okay, it's still rising, and so it's geologically a little bit unstable still. But what we're knowing is, regardless, the whole world was covered by water. That's what it looked like. The duration of the flood, over a year. That tells you again, it was worldwide because a local flood is gone in a very short period of time. And it doesn't take very long at all. And the very idea of the rainbow, God promises not to have that judgment again of flooding. And but think about how many local floods there have been even in the last 20 years. And so God would not have kept his promise, and we know he does. And so we could pretty well conclude it was a flood unlike anything we see today. All right. And not only that, we find much geologic evidence worldwide. And when we look at the geologic formations, remember what Mary Jo mentioned yesterday about different lenses.
Yeah.
If you look at a wall through a red lens, it looks red. Through a yellow lens, it'll look yellow. If you look through the geologic layers through a old age lens, all you see is lots of time. But if you look at it through a lots of water lens instead of lots of time, then you might see something entirely different. And that's what I see. I used to believe only in the long ages of the earth. And then I started realizing that there's a lot of evidence for a younger age of the earth as well. Okay, different lenses. Look at that formation that you see in Southern California. It's a split mountain near the Anza-Borrega Desert. And what you see is that mountain is made up of water-worn boulders. I mean, they were rolled around in some kind of a catastrophic event. Some of those boulders, like the center one there, is the size of a large dump truck. And so, it takes a pretty hard, lots of current, lots of depth, and a high velocity to move boulders like that. Have you seen any of this before, Bill? This type of stuff?
I actually haven't been to the Grand Canyon or the canyons that were carved out after Mount St. Helens. So I've only seen photos. I haven't physically been there.
Oh, you need to go someday.
Is that the actual color of it? It looks
What's that?
green. It looks green. Is that the actual color of that rock?
No, it's not. It's just kind of a beige color is what it is. Do you have green glasses on? No.
No, but it looks like green grass. If that's how green it looks.
There could be some grass on there, but it's mostly rock. All right. And
May I point out something?
sure.
I grew up in Massachusetts. I spent my summers at the ocean. And I spent all my time watching the tides go in and out, and the markings that were left in the sand as the tide rushed out.
Oh yeah.
The first time I ever flew from Chicago to California, I was looking out the window at the landscape below me, and what I saw was a fast receding water.
I
like
believe you're right.
Out. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
It's right there. It's right there to see.
Yeah, that's one thing nice about the Western United States, especially. You don't have all of that biology covering all that good geology. Okay, so you can see more what's going on there. But you also see evidence, even in Missouri, Kansas, etc., of great big giant ripple marks. These are huge ripple marks from flooding of glacial ice lakes that burst, or even the receding floodwaters of Noah's Day. You have both of them going on. And yes, you can see that as you fly across the United States if your eyes and mind are open to it. Okay? That means if you see that, you have on a pair of glasses that allows for the flood. If you don't have that, you might just totally space it out and not see it. All right. Here's the Split Mountain. Again, the same area, but a little different spot. Look at these layer after layer after layer of water-worn boulders separated by fine boulders. And some of these boulders up here are about the size of that Jeep. So you have high velocity pulsating currents there, depositing that material. High velocity, we know because of the size of the boulders. You can't move that without a lot of deep water. The Anza-Borrega Desert, very close by, has a boulder material, this black material here on your left, forcing its way into those rock formations on your right, kind of like a fist into a layer cake. Notice how these layers bend down this way. whoops, come back here, and then bend up that way. That means these layers were still soft at the time that this came through here. And according to standard geology, this represented 100 million years of geologic history. Well, wait a minute. It only takes a few hundreds of years to turn this type of material into solid rock. That's because of the chemistry of it. Okay. All right. So we had an event that occurred in the past of Mount St. Helens erupting, didn't we? We learned a lot from that. Mount St. Helens is in Western Washington, right about the tip of that arrow. It was a gorgeous place to go for a vacation at one time. All right. But the mountain took up the bad habit of beginning to puff a little smoke. It began smoking, but then the geologists started noticing something very, very disturbing. The mountain was beginning to bulge, kind of like I do when I eat too much food for a while. I begin to bulge a little bit. Well, the mountain began to bulge toward the north and the east at a rate of about 18 to up to 40 feet per day. Now, if you live near a volcano and it's bulging toward you, what do you think you ought to do? Run! Get better yet, get in your vehicle and drive, right? And then sure enough, that mountain, as the geologists were starting to predict, became unstable. And then 1/3 of this mountain slid off and released the pressure. And that was the start of the eruption of Mount St. Helens. May 18th, 1980. What an event. Denver, Colorado, and even Grand Junction had a little bit of Mount St. Helens on our sidewalks. Okay, just a little bit. And I want you to understand that everybody thinks that Mount St. Helens eruption was such a big eruption. Yeah, well, it was very newsworthy, that's for sure. But compared to some of the volcanoes in the past, this is a little pop gun. Think about Yellowstone National Park. Do you realize that's all a volcanic area? And they have a crater at Yellowstone National Park, just the one inner crater. It's 45 miles in diameter. And there was more debris, a lot more debris blown out of Yellowstone than Mount St. Helens. And so if the amount of debris blown out of Mount St. Helens is represented by the end of my finger here, the amount that came out of Yellowstone would be a cube. My height, let's say 6 feet by 6 feet by 6 feet. One finger compared to all that. So you see, this is a little thing compared to Yellowstone. And Yellowstone had multiple eruptions, okay? And so that's why we love taking people on tours of Yellowstone National Park. We really do. And so what we see here is we lost a lot of mountain that day, but we gained a huge knowledge. This is a before and the after. See the dotted line there. But look down below in front of you in the foreground of that picture. You notice canyons there, don't you?
Yeah.
Those canyons weren't there prior to 1980. And those canyons have sidewalls made up of sedimentary, you might say, volcanic layers that weren't there prior to that eruption either. And so we got a whole new picture of geology when we look at it. There's a better picture showing those canyons and then some of the features of the layering. But keep in mind, this one big canyon you see goes for about 8 miles. All right. And that's a big canyon. Turns out you're going to see that canyon was carved in mostly one day. One day. And that's because the heat kind of melted some of the glaciers up here. And that glacier then began, this is a secondary thing, all of a sudden, all that ice went to water and that had a huge flood down through here, carving out a big canyon in a short period of time. All right. Now we think sometimes that it takes a long time to make fine layers like that, but that's not the case. What we see is fine layers are quickly deposited. You see several different, 3 events here with the Mount St. Helens in a couple of different days. So 3 events, whoa, making all of these fine layers. That just slapped us geologists in the face that have been trained about millions and millions of years. No, it doesn't take long to make those kind of layers at all. I've been to Badlands. You know, usually what they would tell you at the Badlands National Park, they will tell you that those particular erosional features would take millions of years to form, and the layers themselves more millions of years. Isn't that every place you go, you hit millions of years, right, guys? That's what you get. But we might ask the ranger, well, wait a minute. Didn't we see the same type of layers at Mount St. Helens form in one day? Well, they would say, that was a special event at Mount St. Helens. Well, maybe this one was a special event as well. But they say you can't get this kind of erosion in a short period of time. Well, I beg to differ. Mount St. Helens had steam blasts that produced steam pits with the same type of badland topography. And so what do we see? It doesn't take long to get those type of deposits and erosion. It just doesn't at all. Here's the canyon here. A lot of people think that streams are carved canyons. Turns out because the canyon was there, it captured the stream. So the canyon was there as a result of the catastrophic flow coming off of Mount St. Helens that occurred in mostly one day, right? And then that canyon goes for 8 miles back there, by the way, through freshly laid deposits. But also that canyon is also formed through hard rock. And according to Peter Frenzen, a park scientist, he said, you would expect a hard rock canyon to be thousands, even hundreds of thousands of years old. But this was cut in less than 10 years. Turns out the bulk of it was all cut in one day. Okay, it does not take eons of time to do that if the conditions are right. And there's where my lens of a lot of water in a little bit of time is again authenticated right here. You see that? Okay. All right. So think about the little bit of water at Mount St. Helens compared to the amount of water and erosion due to Noah's flood. Okay. Bill, you were interested in the graphics at one time.
Yes.
You have to be creative sometimes. All right. So you find a usable boat. Then you go to Yellowstone National Park and take a picture of the waterfalls and a picture of the hot springs. You put them all together and you have a violent flood. You see?
Yes.
A little creativity and you have a graphic, okay? And if not, you also realize that with that amount of water that we're talking about at the flood, you have currents, heavy duty currents. Yes. And this is one of the hot springs at Yellowstone, by the way. But representing fountains of great deep opening up. But you also have tsunamis, etc. And when we look at tsunamis, major waves, think about the erosion of all of this stuff at the time of the flood and following as the mountains are rising up and valleys are sinking down. You're going to get a lot of erosion that produces a lot of grains of particles and a lot of mud. And so when you look at geology, I want you to think, here is a principle of geology. When you see mud, think flood. Does that make sense to you?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, look at all that petrified mud there at Bryce Canyon, which is a gorgeous spot. We've taken plenty of students there. All right. And think flood, petrified mud. We go to the Colorado National Monument. You see what? Petrified mud, sand mud, not put down by wind, but by water in this case. And part of the field trip I led today was showing the evidence of a lot of water. But when you look at this, you say, whoa, wait a minute, hold on. A lot of water, because you've got, think flood with all this mud. All right. And so this Colorado National Monument, by the way, is a gorgeous place. If anybody's been to the Garden of the Gods, this is the scenery of Garden of the Gods. Instead of 1 mile, it's 22 miles across that rim. All right. So it's a gorgeous spot to visit. And so, yeah. Again, what do you see? When I look at the Colorado National Monument, they'll tell you it takes millions of years to form canyons, okay? But when you look at that particular canyon, you see evidence that at first there was a lot of water going through there, big broad canyon. And then as the water channelized, you get this V in the center, right? And before it drops down into the valley. And so we see evidence of a lot of flooding. When you look at the side of the canyons, you see these U-shaped formations. Like here, you see this point coming out. Well, this is a big U-shaped meeting with another U-shape, meeting with another U-shape. These are U-shaped head canyons, are indicative of water coming through, you might say, a saturated sand mixture, water draining out. And in hydrology, you learn the term sapping. And when you see sapping, you are looking at softer sediment erosion. And it's coming out, forming U-shaped headlands. And we see that throughout the West, all the way through the Grand Canyon, here at the Grand Colorado National Monument too. Beautiful place to go, but full of good evidence of the flood. All right. Skip that for tonight. We go to Eastern Washington, we see even more evidence of a flood. At least some kind of a flood, which is an aftermath, possibly, of the Noah's flood. This is Dry Falls in Eastern Washington. And when you go there, you look at this, you see, wait a minute, this is flat as a pancake. What do you mean falls? Well, according to standard geology, there was a major waterfall through here that extended for many miles. And it was a depth of maybe 500 to 700 feet above the horizon. That's a lot of water. Well, there's no way. Geologists totally dismiss that. But what we see is a big plunge pool, and we're going to look at that. It wasn't until years later, after they started seeing the evidence for a flood in Eastern Washington, that they started noticing shorelines of a lake. Now, Deborah, you're familiar with those type of shorelines, aren't you? All right. But this lake would have drowned the city of Missoula, Montana to a depth of 1,000 feet. And the dam of that lake would have been further south or further northwest, way down here. And according to standard geology today, there was a glacial ice dam that blocked the Clark Fork of the Columbia River. And what that did was form this great big lake over here. Now, we give tours to Costa Rica. We do presentations in Costa Rica. What we like to say is this one lake would be bigger than the country of Costa Rica. And the people will go, whoa, that's a lot of water. And sure enough, at the glacial ice dam, according to standard geology, the depth of the water would have been 2,000 feet deep.
Mm.
Now, Bill, how would you like to build a dam on a big lake like that that's 2,000 feet deep out of ice?
Mm.
You recognize an issue there? And sure enough, the water broke through. And when it broke through, it went right down through this area, took out Glacial Lake. That was Glacial Lake Missoula, took out Glacial Lake Columbia, and it all ended up coming down this way in through eastern Washington. And so this ice dam here, all that water drained through the Columbia Lake, etc. And you see this flooding, according to this diagram, occurred over this entire region. This is an area of 100 miles by 200 miles, inundated by a great big collapse of water. And there are the shorelines, okay? There are the shorelines. This is Missoula, Montana. Can you imagine all of a sudden, all of this water cutting loose at the same time? You don't want to be downstream, okay? You really don't. And I can't even have a picture drawn that really shows the magnitude of that. But from horizon to horizon, you're seeing a depth of water 300, 500, up to 700 some feet deep over the horizon. And that's why they call this Dry Falls today, because it's a site of a waterfall. When you look downstream from it, you see a huge canyon, and you realize that canyon wasn't there prior to the collapse of Lake Missoula. And in fact, this whole canyon was formed in only as little as 24 to 48 hours. Did you catch that? 1 to 2 days. And this canyon here is 6 miles wide, up to 900 feet deep, and goes for 22 miles from here all the way down to Soap City, Washington. And so you understand what the power of water will do.
Yes, yes.
All right. At the same time that is happening, there are hundreds of other channels that are also waterfalls. Now, this is Palouse Falls right now. It's 180 feet deep, high. That's a pretty good sized waterfall, isn't it?
Yeah.
And quite a bit of water coming down through there. But look at this huge plunge pool. This means there's a lot more water. And you wonder how much water, and you look at the hills here, and you realize they're all water worn. That means the water was over the top of the horizon. And this was a huge waterfall going right down, forming that canyon. And if you were to jump off of this canyon, it's 1,300 feet deep. That's a big canyon, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, and it formed in as little as 24 to 48 hours. A lot of the debris ended up below Soap City, Washington, in what is called the Quincy Basin. And here I am with the group of students here. That's not me there, but this is one of the RAs here. But notice this house-sized boulder of solid volcanic rock. And wait a minute, that was rafted by this flood. Okay, the flood carried that. But look at all these other boulders here. It's like boulders, like a potato field here. But these are all boulders 6 feet in diameter, 8 foot in diameter, house size. If you drill down there for 200-300 feet, you will still encounter boulders down through there, left over from this particular debris. So when I see boulder fields like that, and you're on a field trip with me, watch out, because I'm going to swing my arm and point and say, boulders. And pretty soon, when I'm on a field trip with students, all I have to do this and the students holler boulders. I don't have to say a word. And so we come by this particular patch in Utah. And what do you see?
Boulders.
Boulders. Lots and lots
Lots
of
of boulders.
boulders. The interesting thing about these boulders here, at Escalona, Utah, when you look at that, whoa, wait a minute. This is on the tops of the canyon, the very top of the canyon. Look at that. And it goes down for almost 1,000 feet down there. And so we had a major flooding of material to deposit, at least in my book, those particular boulders way up high. And so let's go to middle of Idaho, Twin Falls. What do you see? Boulders the size of automobiles. And so I see there was a major flow of water going through this area at one time. That's evident. That's evident to me. Okay. And when you look at the near Salt Lake City, you see shorelines of some lake over here. All right. You see this shoreline right there? That shoreline, it happens to be above Great Salt Lake to let's say approximately 1,000 feet deeper than the present Great Salt Lake. There's the shoreline, but that means the water depth here was at least 1,000 feet deeper. And so Salt Lake City would have been pretty well submerged, wouldn't it? And so you see the shoreline there. And that lake would have covered approximately 1/3 the state of Utah. And when we're giving tours in Costa Rica or speaking at the universities there, we say that lake would have been bigger than Costa Rica as well. All right. And then that catastrophically drained in a huge waterfall heading to the north and the west and a little bit to the east into Wyoming. And so that would be, and we know the site where it actually broke through near Red Rock, Idaho. And or Red Rock Pass near Downey, Idaho. And then all that water would have formed Snake River Canyon. According to standard geology, Snake River Canyon, like you see it here, was not there 30 days before the event. All right, it's brand new. And those boulders that I showed you, the size of automobiles, are on top of the rim, meaning the depth of the water was a couple hundred feet above the rim in order to be able to carry the size boulder. Okay, so what are you getting a picture of? Lots of water and a little bit of time, right? Doesn't take long. Dury, who's a geomorphologist, he's studied river channels for a long time. And he realized that the water that is carried in those channels are not adequate to explain the size of the canyon. And that's 95% of all the canyons in the world.
Use like cheesy pejoratives when referring to your political adversaries. It may be nice to learn how to pronounce them.
Okay, I heard somebody's material on there. So if you want to meet unless you're asking a question. Okay, well, let's think about that. That even includes the Grand Canyon. It includes the Snake River Canyon, etc. But all of that water we talked about, like in Missoula flood, that was a monstrous flood from the collapse of an ice age lake. Well, up in Siberia, there was even a bigger flood that's, they say, 10 times more water than the Missoula flood, and left mountain ridges as ripple marks. All right, and huge canyons in a very short period of time, coming out of the Altai Mountains in Siberia. You go to Australia, you find wave rock. You just imagine the water rolling off of wave rock, can't you? All right, let's see here. Okay, you can imagine the water rolling off of that. Huh. Isn't that amazing? Are you with me on, can you see my slide here on Wave Rock? Okay, good, good. I just did something on the other screen, and so I'm hoping it wouldn't affect this one. This goes for many miles, by the way. What does that tell you? There's a lot more water in Australia crashing through there as well. So my point is this: time is not the hero of the plot, not for erosion. The conditions are much more important. A lot of water lands with a little bit of time is what I see. Not a lot of time with a little bit of, did I say that right? A lot of water with a little bit of time is all it takes. So is Darwin wrong about geology? Well, you know, on the Beagle, he sailed up along the coast of South America. He saw many, many layers due to volcanism. And he said, oh, must have taken eons of time to make those layers. What did we see at Mount St. Helens? Not eons of time at all. It was instantaneous almost how you got those layers formed. But he also took a smaller boat up the Santa Cruz River. And when he was up in this area, he saw this particular volcanic bluff. And he said, oh my, eons of time must have taken for this little river carving this particular gorge. Well, guess what? He missed some things. He missed the boulders up here. All right. He should have had me along. I point boulders. Okay. But anyhow, or these boulders here in the foreground. He missed all of that. And that should have told him there was a bigger story here, that this whole canyon was probably carved out in a very short period of time. And now there's evidence of a big lake that had collapsed upstream here on the Santa Cruz River. So you see why I see flood evidences all over. Does that make sense to you? All right. I take people to Canyonlands, which is about 90 miles from Grand Junction. And remember Dry Falls? That was, wait a minute, Dry Falls would fit in an area this big, the little W right here. You see an arrow that goes across that screen? Is that showing up? Okay. That would be the size of Dry Falls. Well, from where we're standing to where you're looking at the far cliff here is 18 miles. So we're looking at what, to me, a lot of water that actually carved out this entire area. So I see evidence for the flood when I look at that. I see evidence for that flood at the Grand Canyon as well. But the standard interpretation, millions of years of gradual erosion. One of the, we had a 19-year-old son with the family there that was with that group that I took on the Colorado National Monument Tour. He's from, they're from Israel. And this particular young man told me afterwards, it sure is nice to hear something other than millions and millions of years when you go to one of these parks. So, but what do we see? No, I don't see evidence of millions of years. I see evidence of a lot of water in a short period of time. It fits for the big lake. So you have two ways of carving the Grand Canyon according to the flood model. Number one way, of course, would be the receding waters from the Noahic flood. That would be one way of doing it. The second way is also coming into play is when you have different high, you might say upwarps and things that are like blocking things, then you block this great big, the rivers, and you make big lakes over here, okay? And according to what we're looking at, there's a huge lake upstream from the Grand Canyon. And there was a lake up here that actually, we think, collapsed And I think I found pretty much the where it actually barreled in from the collapse of this one to this bigger lake right here. I think we have the site, and so it's exactly the right level, etc. And boulders all over in that one little road cut through here. And so we think this collapse taken, and then it caused a surge, which also caused this to form. And then when you have breaking of the earth's crust, all of a sudden this water, the land, this river that was going this way, suddenly takes a right-hand turn and goes this way, right through the Grand Canyon. That means to get over this upwarp, you have to have a lot of force behind it. And you can only do that with the collapse of a lake or a deep enough fault. All right. So those boulders that I was first showing you, the size of a dump truck, they're right downstream. And you have the same type of material as you find in this section of the Grand Canyon. Smoking gun here, isn't it? In which case, in that idea, if you have floodwaters, the receding flood can carve out a good share of that canyon, or even big giant lakes like that can cause a big canyon to form in weeks, not millions and millions of years. Okay, right near Grand Junction, Colorado. We live in a perfect spot for a lot of geology. All right, is Montrose, Colorado, and just near there is the Black Canyon of the Gunnison, another park. And when you look at it, this is the Gunnison River. Now, did this Gunnison River carve this big canyon? Or was there a break in the ground that tore the ground apart and captured the Gunnison River, which used to travel way around in a big circle? Now the river takes a shortcut through this gorge. To me, this river did not carve this gorge, but this gorge was there as a result of a tear fault, which captured that river. All right. And I had geologists take me to task at that. And I think it's pretty, to me, I think it's fairly obvious when you see it. When I go to places like Sierra Nevadas and California, and you look across there, beautiful mountains, but I see something else when I look across. See this right here? It looks like an island in a water flow. Whoa. So you hike down to the bottom of this thing, and what do you find? Go to the bottom, you find a little bit of water, but you see evidence of sculpting from a lot of water coming down through there. And so that kind of helps substantiate the lot of water model. If you have water going down, yes, it's going to curve things out. In which case, that water is no longer just plain clear water, is it? It's got mud in it. It's got boulders in it, sand and boulders and bigger boulders. That becomes a cement slurry traveling at a high velocity. And that cement slurry has to stop somewhere. And here's Mary Jo here at Death Valley, California. And look at that. This is a dump of one of these cement slurries. And when it actually went through, made a canyon, but it also carved, not only carved the canyon, but coated the canyon with the cement. That's why they call this Mosaic Canyon in Death Valley, one of the lowest point in North America. So we see evidence of that cement flow stopping with a big dump down through here. All right. It all fits very nicely together and fits nicely with the flood. All right. Now, let me stop for a minute and see if you have any questions at this point.
Well, not a question so much as, I don't know, kind of a, if water was responsible for carving out, say, the canyon of the Gunnison,
yeah,
wouldn't all the sides be smooth?
Yes, they would be more sloped rather than one big crack. That's
So
why I
how come
call
I
it
can figure that out?
What?
How come I can figure that out and these experts can't?
Because you have the different lens that you're viewing things with. And you will allow for catastrophic processes like earthquakes forming canyons.
Right.
Okay, that's why.
Unbelievable, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. All right. Bill, I see you were trying to make a
I had the
comment.
same question with so much evidence from around the world, and it's all consistent. You know, the boulders, the rocks, the
Sure.
stratification. You didn't show the trees, you know, the vertical trees and so on, but there's so
Not
much.
yet.
Yeah, there's so much consistent evidence all around the world that supports a global flood. How can they counter that?
Ignoring it. And they say, well, do you believe in creation? Oh, yeah. Okay, then I can dismiss you.
Right.
You see, that's the bias that goes on there. And yeah, I had a professor one time. I went to an anti-creationist seminar, and he gave the standard spiels and all that. But he was one of my professors when I in geology, and I was in the audience, and in fact, most of the people in the audience were followers of us, of AOI. And, but anyhow, I asked a question, and I said, and basically the question came down to it, where I asked a question and he looked at me and he said, were you he always used to tell me the students never think like I do. I'm going to go a long way in geology. He said, nobody aces my test. You've aced them all. Okay. And that's because I studied. Okay. The rest of the geologists were out partying. So anyhow, but regardless of that, so I was going to go a long ways in geology. And then I asked this one question. He kind of tensed up a little bit and he looked at me. He says, were you a creationist when you were in my class? I said, well, as a matter of fact, I was. He said, well, if I knew that, I would never have passed you. See the bias? See the bias there. And so you never know. In fact, then I asked him specifically about if now that you're head of the department, if you said I'd be a good teacher, I'd be really good. I said, would you consider hiring me here at Colorado Mesa University? Not with your wacky ideas. That's all I wanted him to say. There is a sieve. And he talked about that sieve then as well. All right. All right. So do the radioactive decay dating methods prove these layers are millions and millions of years old? Well, it turns out you have to ask a big question. Are they accurate? And then the second question is, how do you know they are accurate? You're always using them to date rocks of unknown age. So how do you know if you're right or wrong? Well, you date something of known age. Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980. 30 years later, they took some samples of a recent volcanic dome that built up within the crater of Mount St. Helens. So when that hardened, that was about 30 years. Okay. And so what happened here is they should get an age of that no more than 20 or 30 years. And it turns out that the dates they got when they sent that to the lab was 340,000 to 2.8 million years old. Something's wrong. Something's wrong. Same thing in New Zealand, okay? When you go to New Zealand, you see, again, dates of stuff that happened just recently, the hundreds of thousands of millions of years. Recent flows in Hawaii were dated. And basically, they saw this lava flow and then later decided to date it. Turns out that the dates they got on this lava flow was 3 million to 1 billion years old. This is after it all cooled, they could take a sample. So something is drastically wrong. And we found the same thing in the Grand Canyon. There was a lava flow that flowed down into the canyon at one time, blocked the river. So this should be very recent compared to, say, these layers underneath the canyon, correct? And so, but they dated this, and turns out the dates on this lava flow were yielding dates um, of at least as old and up to twice as old as the rock layers underneath the entire canyon. Something was drastically wrong. I pointed it out to a ranger there, a geologist there. He said, well, your data's got to be wrong. I said, well, here it is. Take a look at it. And then I told him, I'll be back. Next year, I saw the same ranger. I asked him the same questions. He said, oh, you again. And he said, but I found out you're 100% right. There are problems there. And I said, well, great. How come you're giving the same ranger talk? In other words, I wasn't quite that blunt, but, he said, well, it has been shown that these methods are not accurate on recent events. Okay, so I just asked them, if these methods don't give you accurate results on recent events, on rocks of known age, how do you rely on them to give you accurate results on rocks of unknown age? He had no answer for that whatsoever. Okay. All right. And to me, I see evidence of a flood. One of the big evidences for the flood that I'm going to, by the way, you cannot, even according to the geologist, when somebody asks the question, how do you know how old these rocks are in the Grand Canyon? He said, all of these rocks have been dated by radioactive decay dating methods, and these methods are very accurate. That's what he said. Yeah. And I said, sir, do you realize there isn't a single rock layer from here on down to almost the bottom of the canyon that you can date by radioactive decay dating? Because they contain the wrong kind of rocks. He said, oh yeah, I forgot about that. And so, all right. But we see evidence in the rocks themselves of the flood, even in some of the fossils. When you go down to Texas, and what do you find? A whole area along the Biloxi River with all of these beautifully preserved clams. They're whole. Now, when a clam dies, the shell's open, don't they? Okay, the shell's open. The fact they're all whole, and I'll tell you that they were basically buried alive, didn't have a chance to dig their way out. And we have clams like that right behind me on my bookshelf, or some of my fossil collection. You see whole clams, you find a shell, and when you look at that shell, you look at, it's the whole thing, the top and the bottom, and it wasn't closed, opened up. And so you see evidence of massive burial. Okay, that's what we do see in the Biloxi River. Fits beautifully with the flood. You go into the Grand Canyon here, and you find in this particular layer of the Grand Canyon, supposedly put down in a calm ocean, you find these nautolite fossils, and a squid-like creature lived in there. And those particular fossils are anywhere from 3 inches up to 3 feet long in that layer there at the Grand Canyon. And they're all oriented the same way. That means they were sorted hydrodynamically by moving water. All right. And so there's evidence of water flow in here. All these particular layers, you see evidence of water flow, including the sandstones in here as well. And this book is kind of like taking a geologist and a biologist in Grand Canyon. And it's even better because you put a big circle around what you're looking at, say, away across the canyon, and give you the explanation of what you're seeing there. It's a great book. We have it in our bookstore here. When you go into Wyoming, you find Fossil Butte National Monument, and here's a slab about 360 fish on it, perfectly preserved, not a fin out of place. And what does that tell you? Rapid burial, okay? And not a fin out of place. Little fish like that one, barely bigger than a paperclip, or a little bit bigger ones, or here's a palm frond, maybe 10 feet long with perfectly preserved fish. Again, that shows rapid burial. And you say, how rapid was this burial? Well, that guy is eating his lunch. Both of them got trapped. All right. Evidence of catastrophe right there. Dinosaur National Park over here, evidence of mass burial of dinosaurs. And we see literally, what do you say, 92 different dinosaurs perfectly preserved, but ripped apart. Now, what kind of spring runoff rips apart a 70-ton dinosaur? It's a big one, not your average spring runoff, okay? So we see that all the time. And we see evidence not only of the fossils in the rock layers, but I hate to admit it, but when I see rock layers, I get hungry. I do. I think of rock layers of big pancakes. Okay, one pancake stacked on top of another. Maybe this one's a blueberry pancake, but one after another, all covered by nice caramel syrup or maple syrup and with the butter on top, right? Do you see how hungry I can get? But what do you do as a geologist when you see one petrified tree cutting through all of your pancakes? All right, that tells you those pancakes aren't that old. For instance, here's what I'm talking about. If these layers are hundreds, tens to hundreds of millions of years old, then you would not be able to preserve the tree in here. It would have rotted pretty quickly. You might get one piece of it, but you're not going to get the whole thing. And we find that this is what you were referring to a little bit ago, Bill, about the trees going through many strata called polystrate or polystrata trees. And so here's one, they're going through there. Here's one right here. And there's one over here. Here's another one over here. You've got all these trees going through multiple layers, multiple pancakes, okay? So here you see a petrified tree going through this big stack of pancakes. So that tells you that stack of pancakes had been put down pretty rapidly. There goes a lot of millions of years, okay? And you can't have evolution if you don't have those millions and millions of years. All right, here's a close-up view of one of those logs right there. But notice that doesn't even have roots. That means it was ripped up and deposited here. All right, that's what it looks like. And you find these polystrate fossils basically all over in different parts of the world. All right, that fits with the flood very nicely. It doesn't fit with slow and gradual deposition. Now, what would you think if the bottom pancake layers, one of these, all of a sudden, this sandstone layer that supposedly put down millions of years ago poked its way through all of the layers above? If this supposedly represents 30 million years, this would have been solid rock. This could not have happened. That's Kodachrome Basin near Bryce Canyon in Utah. All right, I love taking students to this spot. And there you see one sticking up through the butter of the pancake layer right here. All right, one here. Here's another one. You go to another spot, you see the pancakes all stacked below, and this one's sticking up through the butter. And here's another view of the same thing from a different perspective from above. And isn't that amazing? What does that tell you about those pancakes? Those were put down rapidly. Otherwise, this would have been, could not have happened. And so this 30 million years of geologic history is history. It's gone. You can't have that at all. So it's one of my favorite places to take students. And Kodachrome Basin, you may want to venture there someday if you have opportunity. All right. And there are 165 of these structures in a reasonably small region there in Utah. And what it tells me is this: is that you had a flood with soft sediment, it hadn't hardened yet, and maybe you had something like a meteor strike, crash in. Hydraulic activity would say once you put pressure this way, all of a sudden the layers just pop up this way. Okay, giving you those particular structures. So that's what I'm seeing right there. And that's what you might find in the hydraulics of the Noahic flood. So you would easily generate currents 150 miles per hour up to 1,000 feet deep with the Noahic floodwaters. No problem whatsoever. You would clean off whatever surface you have. Well, go to Colorado Springs, Manitou, and you see at the even nearer the Garden of the Gods, you have this particular Pikes Peak granite. It was planed off. So it was cut. This is called the Great Unconformity, which is worldwide. On top of it, later, after this was cut off by the onslaught of floodwaters, then the layers were put down. This is a sandstone layer. The very same pancake that you see here, you also find in the bottom of the Grand Canyon on the very right above the black material in the inner gorge. And notice this is a bunch of smaller pancakes, but look at the size of this rock. All right. No, this sand was not deposited by wind. Okay. No, it's a high velocity flow that's going on in this particular area. And this particular rock is found in a layer below the top eight sandstone. So it didn't fall in from above. It was plucked up, carried, and dropped as the sediment was being put down. But I say Colorado Springs, you have this pancake. This is at the Grand Canyon. It goes all the way down into Mexico, clear to the eastern seaboard over here, but you also find it all the way north of Greenland over here. That is one big pancake. That says that this flood was not local. It's got to be regional to global in order to generate those kind of currents. All right. And so we've got other massive limestones the same way as you have massive sandstones. All right. It's the same. These are the different names of the same pancake. It's the same pore of pancake pore, and it covers a good share of the continent. You've got the Niobrara Formation that goes all the way from Colorado, but you also find it across most of the U.S. And wait a minute, it doesn't stop at the ocean. You now find it, it's called the White Cliffs of Dover, but you also find it in Israel, etc. This is even more of a gigantic pancake layer. What does this tell you? Global flood, not some kind of a local thing. All right. And yeah. So the most documented biblical event is nicely supported by archaeological discoveries, historical record, biblical record, yep, and much geologic evidence as well. So these are all different types of the evidences for the flood. So the conclusion is Noah's flood, was that fiction or was it reality? I say reality. All right. Definitely would be reality. And that talks to me about the reliability of the Bible. Okay. That you can trust it. And if I can trust Genesis 6-8, which are some of the most attacked chapters of the Bible because of the flood, then, and if those are now true, then I better take the parts of the Bible that talk about Jesus Christ dying on a cross seriously as well. Can you understand what I'm getting at? And so it was the ark last time. The ark today is the work of Jesus Christ on the cross. It's what he did. Now, I don't want to stop there because the flood speaks of judgment, doesn't it? But a lot of people think, oh, that's a God of judgment. We like grace. Well, guess what? you find grace all the way through the Noah's flood. All right. You find grace through the Old Testament, not just judgment. You see God's favor all the way through. But Noah, according to the scripture, found grace or favor in the eyes of the Lord. He found favor there. The ark was built for protection for any of those who believe, and also the animals. Talk about animal rights. Okay. God was interested in that. Noah's wife, his sons, his daughter-in-laws get to go. How would you like it if your daughter-in-law can't go? That would not be very good. But and then God tells Noah, come into the ark. What does that mean? God is there with him. He's not out there someplace. He's with them. In his presence is with them in one way or the other. Okay. Now, God didn't make Noah close the door. God closed it himself. So Noah would never have to think, oh, I shut out poor Uncle Bill over there. Okay. Or poor Uncle Enoch. No. Then it says God remembered Noah. This word is a watchful care of Noah. It's not, oh, I forgot all about Noah. I wonder how he's doing down there. No, it's a watchful care. And then God's promise, he knows our hearts. He's not going to send another flood like that again, the sign of the rainbow. So we see God's grace in the midst of the flood, don't we? And tomorrow night, we're going to talk about the Tower of Babel after the flood, and the Ice Age occurring as a result of the flood. And we're going to see how dinosaurs fit into this whole perspective. And why would I put dinosaurs even post-flood? Well, some of them got killed in the flood, I'm sure. But there's evidence of post-flood dinosaurs as well. So we're going to be talking about that tomorrow night. Make sure your friends come so they can discover creation. Okay, any other comments?
I have a question.
Yep, go ahead.
I know you're asked this 100 times, and I want 1,000,000 times. And I want to say, first of all, that it's not a question that bothers me, but it's a question I don't know how to answer when others ask me.
Okay.
And that is, they find big things like dinosaurs, and they find little things like seashells and clams, but they don't find people in the fossil record.
Mm-hmm.
How do you justify that when people ask you that?
There are ways of looking at it, okay? And this is also true of many of the mammal fossils. You find them up higher in the geologic record, and you say, why? Well, mammals have a tendency, including people, when we drown, to bloat and float.
Oh, right.
That means we're going to make awful good white shark meat.
Food, yep.
Okay. And our skin is pretty delicate too. When you have high abrasion of high velocity waters, guess what? Our skin will be peeled right off, muscles and ligaments, and we'll be strewn all over. And then there's also the idea that people would grab a hold of branches, right? Floating things. They try to stay afloat as long as possible. And basically they would eventually fall off, becoming shark meat, okay, again. And so we see all of that as a possibility. And then the scripture says, God blotted mankind off the face of the earth.
Do you know the reference? I mean, I can
Nope.
look it up, but
I will try to get that to you. Okay, Mary Jo, do you know what that reference is?
No, I don't have it right off the bat.
that's all right. I've got Bible Gateway. I'll find it.
There you
Okay.
go. Blotted is like an erased. And he blotted a lot of things off the face of the earth at that particular point. And so that's one of the things, and I think he did a pretty good job of it. But we do see isolated cases of human fossils found in, and they usually, when you see it in the magazine, they say, "Oh, this family was killed in a, or this group was killed in some kind of a local flood." Well, it may have been Noah's flood. It may have been the aftermath of Noah's flood. It could be any of that kind of thing. Okay. And so we see that near Moab, Utah, there's a dinosaur area where you find dinosaur bone. It's interesting because they found uh, human remains in that area, and probably in just 1948 near Moab, Utah. And the thing is, the person that was present at the time, geologist, said this person was buried at the same time these layers were being put down. That put them at the same age of supposed dinosaurs. Okay. Now, but the problem is later geologists now dispute it. Oh no, he must have been buried in there. Any explanation to kind of explain it away.